The HOA sent me a $40,000 fine for building too big of a lake cabin. The crazy part? I wasn't even in their HOA. The HOA president, a nasty woman named Marcia, stormed onto my property, waving fake papers, threatening to tear down the cabin I built to honor my late wife. She thought she was the law. She thought she had me cornered. What she didn't know was that her entire neighborhood was built on a secret, and I owned the keys to everything. Where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments, because this revenge plan isn't just good, it's biblical. And if you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied by a power-tripping board, hit subscribe, because you're about to see an entire HOA get served eviction notices. The final screw went into the deck railing just as the sun started dipping below the pine trees across the lake. I stood back, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, and a real, honest-to-God smile spread across my face. It was the first one that felt genuine in a long time. The cabin was done. Small, just one bedroom and a wide-open living space with big windows facing the water. It smelled of fresh-cut cedar and pine sap. For 2 years, my son Jake and I had worked on it. He'd helped me lay the foundation, his bad leg propped up on a cooler most days, but his hands were as steady as ever. We used the money from my wife Sarah's life insurance. She was an artist, and this cabin, right here on this little slice of lakefront my dad bought 60 years ago, was her dream. She'd wanted a place to paint the water, to capture the light as it changed from dawn to dusk. Now, all that was left was to move her easel into the corner by the window. I felt a lump form in my throat. It was a place for peace, a place for healing. It was supposed to be anyway. The peace lasted exactly 1 day. The next afternoon, a crisp white envelope appeared in my mailbox, which sits at the end of a long gravel driveway. It had a fancy embossed logo I didn't recognize. Lakewood Bluffs Homeowners Association. I'd heard of them. They were the new development on the other side of the ridge, a bunch of cookie-cutter McMansions with perfectly manicured lawns. I figured it was junk mail, maybe an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue. I tore it open right there at the mailbox. My eyes scanned the boilerplate legal language until they landed on a number that made my stomach drop. $40,000. $40,000. The letter stated I was in violation of architectural standards for constructing a dwelling in excess of approved square footage and in disharmony with the community aesthetic. It demanded I tear the cabin down within 30 days or face further legal action, including liens and foreclosure. I read it 3 times. It had to be a mistake, a clerical error. They must have sent it to the wrong address. I wasn't in their HOA. I wasn't in any HOA. I was just about to head inside to call the number on the letterhead when a silver sedan pulled up the driveway, crunching gravel under its tires. A woman in her mid-50s got out. She had a tight ponytail, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, and a look on her face that said she'd been waiting her whole life to tell someone they parked incorrectly. "Are you Mr. Rigsby?" she asked. Not as a question, but as an accusation. I nodded. "I'm Marcia Dorr, president of the Lakewood Bluffs HOA. She didn't offer a hand, just tapped her pen on her clipboard. "I'm here about the non-compliant structure." She gestured toward the cabin, a look of disgust on her face, as if it were a pile of trash. I held up the letter. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake. My property isn't part of your association." I tried to keep my voice even, calm. "I'm a retired engineer. I solve problems with logic, not emotion. This lot has been in my family for over half a century. We've never been part of an HOA." Marcia let out a little condescending laugh. "Oh, that's a common misconception. The HOA boundaries were expanded 2 years ago to include several of the original lakefront parcels. Your property was grandfathered in. It's all in the amended bylaws. Your cabin," she said the word like it was something foul, "violates Section 8, subsection C, regarding detached structures and aesthetic uniformity. It's too big. And frankly, it's an eyesore. I just stared at her, absorbed, grandfathered in. I never signed anything. I never got a letter, a notice, a single piece of mail about it. I was never notified of any change, I said, the calmness in my voice starting to fray. I never agreed to join. You don't have to agree, she chirped, clearly enjoying herself. It was a board vote. It's perfectly legal. The fine stands. You have 30 days, Mr. Rigsby. With that, she got back in her car and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of bureaucratic tyranny hanging in the air. For a few minutes, I was too stunned to move. But then the engineer in me took over. This was a paperwork problem, and I had the paperwork to fix it. I went into my old office and pulled out the thick file folder with all the property documents. The original deed, signed by my father. The official county survey maps from 1962, clearly showing the property lines, long before Lakewood Bluffs was even a thought in some developer's head. I was confident. No judge in the world would uphold a fine from an HOA I never joined. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I felt a little foolish even going, armed with my file folder like a knight heading into battle. I expected to be in and out in 15 minutes. I'd show the clerk my original plat map. They'd confirm my lot wasn't in the HOA's jurisdiction, and I'd get a signed letter to shove in Marcia Dorr's face. That's not what happened. The clerk, a weary-looking woman who'd clearly seen it all, pulled up the most recent plat map on her computer screen. And there it was. A new, faint, dotted line that looped around my property, snaking along the shoreline to include 5 other old lots along with mine. The clerk pointed a lethargic finger at the screen. Says here, the Lakewood Bluffs HOA filed an amendment to their governing documents 2 years back. Looks like they used a contiguity clause to rezone and absorb these parcels into their common interest development. It was gibberish, but the meaning was clear. They had found a loophole. A shady backroom deal between their lawyers and some zoning board had allowed them to legally swallow my land into their association without my consent. A vote I was never invited to, a meeting I was never told about. I felt the floor drop out from under me. All my careful planning, all my facts and figures, meant nothing. They had rewritten reality, and the county had just rubber-stamped it. I drove home in a daze, the angry buzzing in my head louder than the engine. When I pulled up my driveway, my heart sank. There, slapped right across the new pine door of Sarah's cabin, was a huge bright red sign with thick black letters, "Stop Work Order. Violation of Covenants." By order of the Lakewood Bluffs HOA Architectural Review Committee, the cabin was finished. There was no work to stop. It was a pure power play, an act of public humiliation. My blood ran cold, then hot. I stormed inside and went straight to my laptop to check the feed from the small security camera I'd installed overlooking the driveway. And there it was, footage from an hour earlier. Marcia Dorr's silver sedan pulling up. She got out, but she wasn't alone. 2 large men in matching polo shirts with the HOA logo were with her. The 3 of them marched across my lawn, right past the no trespassing sign, as if they owned the place. The camera caught the whole thing in perfect high definition. Marcia, directing the men as they plastered the sign to my door with a staple gun, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face. She stepped on Sarah's newly planted flower bed to get a better angle for a picture with her phone. She was trespassing, and she was loving every second of it. I ripped the sign off the door, the staples screeching as they came out of the fresh pine. I stood there holding the cheap, red plastic, my knuckles white. This wasn't just a cabin. It was a promise. Every beam, every nail, was paid for with the money Sarah left behind. It was all I had left of her, besides the memories. My son, Jake, had been out there with me from the day we broke ground. He'd just come back from his last tour, walking with a permanent limp and a whole lot of ghosts in his eyes. He couldn't do heavy lifts, but he could measure, he could level, he could run a saw with surgical precision. Laying the foundation, he'd sat on an overturned bucket, directing me, his face tight with pain, but his spirit refusing to break. "A little more to the left, Dad," he'd say. "Gotta be perfect for Mom." This cabin was supposed to be a quiet place for us. A place where the only sound was the lake lapping at the shore, where Jake could maybe find a little peace. Now, it was a battleground. Marcia and her HOA weren't just attacking a building, they were desecrating a memorial. She didn't wait long to twist the knife. The next evening, Jake called me. His voice was low and tight. "Dad, you need to see this." He sent me a link to a town community group on Facebook. Marcia had posted the picture she took, the one of her standing triumphantly in front of the stop work order sign. The caption was, "Pure poison. Concerned citizens. This is what happens when out-of-town developers ignore our community standards and build illegal structures. The Lakewood Bluffs HOA is taking decisive action to protect our property values and the natural beauty of our lake." Comments piled up underneath. Her cronies, mostly. "Thank you for your vigilance, Marcia. Disgusting. Tear it down." It was a public execution. She was painting me as some greedy monster, and a small vocal part of the community was eating it up. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. The HOA board had held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to place a lien on my property for the unpaid fine. Now, they weren't just demanding money. They were making a legal claim to my land. My family's land. I wasn't going to just sit there and take it. I filed a formal complaint with the city, detailing the illegal trespassing and the lack of notification about being absorbed into the HOA. I included a copy of the security camera footage. The response I got a week later was a single, infuriating paragraph. They reviewed the matter and determined it was a private dispute between a homeowner and their association. The city washed its hands of the whole thing. They weren't going to help. Defeated, I did what I should have done first. I called an attorney. A friend recommended Beth Wainwright, a no-nonsense lawyer who specialized in land disputes. I laid everything out on her polished conference table. The deed, the old maps, the threatening letters, the footage of Marcia on my property. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she sighed. "Tom, I'll be straight with you. This is a mess. They used a legal loophole the size of a truck, but on paper, it looks legitimate. They filed the amended plat. The county approved it. You can sue, but they'll drag it out for years. It'll cost you more than the cabin is worth, and in the end, a judge might still side with them based on the recorded documents." My hope evaporated. "So that's it? They just get away with it?" "Unless," she said, tapping a pen on the old plat map, "unless the original landowner of the development's charter can dispute the boundary change. The HOA's legal standing rests entirely on the legitimacy of that expansion. If the entity that owned the access roads and common areas never agreed to it, their whole case falls apart. But we're talking about paperwork from 30, 40 years ago. The developer probably dissolved that company decades back." I drove home feeling lower than I had since the funeral. I was an engineer. I believed in rules, in structure. But Marcia was using the rules as a weapon, twisting them into something ugly and perverse. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, the original deed from my father laid out in front of me. I kept thinking about what Beth had said, the original landowner. I went to my computer and started digging through the county's online land records, parcel by parcel. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I just started typing in names associated with the original development. It was all a tangle of corporate shells and dissolved partnerships. But then, I saw a familiar name pop up on several small, seemingly useless strips of land adjacent to the main road. A holding company I vaguely remembered my father mentioning once. Rigsby and Sons Holdings, LLC. A spark ignited in the back of my mind. My dad was a sharp man. He never bought just one thing. He always bought the things around the thing. He always planned for the future. He'd set up that LLC for tax reasons, and after he passed, I just kept paying the small annual filing fee to the state to keep it active, more out of habit than anything else. I never thought it actually owned anything of value. My hands were shaking as I searched the state's business registry. There it was, Rigsby and Sons Holdings, LLC. Status: active. Registered agent: Thomas Rigsby. I was so focused on my cabin, on my little square of land, that I had completely forgotten. The fight wasn't just about my lot. It was about the entire foundation the neighborhood was built on. A jolt went through me. I remembered an old filing cabinet, a heavy, fireproof one, that I'd moved from my dad's office to a storage unit after he died. It was full of his old business records, things I never had the heart to throw away. The next morning, I was at the storage unit before the manager had even finished his coffee. I rolled up the metal door, and the smell of dust and old paper hit me. There, in the back corner, was the gray cabinet. It took me a few minutes to wrestle the key into the stiff lock, but it finally turned. I pulled open the top drawer, labeled Land Holdings. It was packed with old manila folders. And right in the front was one labeled Lakewood Project. I lifted the file out. It was heavy. Inside was a dusty, leather-bound deed packet, thicker than a dictionary. There were original, hand-drawn survey maps, with notes scrawled in my father's familiar handwriting. And tucked in the back, folded neatly inside a wax paper sleeve, was a document titled Private Easement and Access Agreement for the Lakewood Road System. I unfolded it carefully. It was an ironclad contract granting access to the development's roads and common areas, and it was signed between the original home builder and the landowner of that infrastructure. The landowner, clear as day, was listed as Rigsby and Sons Holdings, LLC, my LLC. The grief and helplessness I'd been carrying for weeks vanished, replaced by something cold, quiet, and sharp, a calm, deadly focus. Marcia Dorr had no idea who she was picking a fight with. She thought she was bullying a grieving old man over his little cabin. She was about to find out she was trespassing on my property. And soon, so was her entire HOA. I walked out of that storage unit holding the file like it was a sacred text. The air smelled different. The sun felt warmer. The weight in my chest, the one I'd been carrying for 2 years, was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, heavy certainty. This was no longer a defense. It was a hunt. My first call was to Beth Wainwright. I met her at her office the next morning and laid the deed packet and the easement agreement on her conference table. She picked up the old documents with a reverence I hadn't seen in her before, handling them like they were fragile artifacts. For 10 minutes, she didn't say a word, just read, her eyes scanning the dense legal language, her finger tracing the faded signatures. Finally, she looked up at me, and for the first time, a slow, dangerous grin spread across her face. "Tom," she said, her voice low and steady, "this isn't just a smoking gun. This is the whole arsenal. The Lakewood Bluffs development was built on land accessed by private roads owned by your LLC. This agreement grants the original builder conditional access. It was never a permanent transfer of ownership, and it was never transferred to the HOA. They don't have a legal leg to stand on. They've been trespassing for 20 years and never even knew it." She leaned back in her chair. "Their entire claim to your property, their entire authority, is based on that illegal expansion. Without the consent of the primary landowner of the infrastructure, that's you, that expansion is null and void. They built a kingdom on rented land, and the rent is long overdue. The legal foundation was there. Now I needed to prove the physical boundaries. Beth knew a guy, Alvin Shrub, a retired county surveyor who lived a few towns over and, as luck would have it, had a long-standing grudge against the Lakewood Bluffs HOA after they'd tried to fine him for having a vegetable garden in his front yard. I drove out to Alvin's place that afternoon. He was a wiry old man in his 70s, with hands like worn leather and eyes that saw the world in degrees and elevations. I explained the situation and showed him the old hand-drawn map from my father's file. His eyes lit up. He took the map into his workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and oiled steel, and laid it out on a massive drafting table. He then pulled out the HOA's amended plat map I'd gotten from the county. Using a light table and a set of antique calipers, he overlaid one on top of the other. It was like watching a master craftsman at work. "See here?" he said, tapping a point with his pencil. "The original charter for the HOA stops at this creek bed. That's their legal boundary. Everything they did 2 years ago was a land grab. They just drew a new line on a map, filed it with a clerk who didn't know any better, and hoped nobody would ever call their bluff." He confirmed it. They had illegally absorbed 6 parcels, including mine, without a single owner's vote. I had the legal proof and the physical proof. While Alvin drew up his official findings, I got to work. With Beth's guidance, I filed the necessary paperwork with the state to formally reactivate every function of Rigsby & Sons Holdings, LLC. I updated the public contact information and filed a new statement of ownership with the county registrar, citing the original deeds from my father's file. It was all quiet, boring paperwork, certified letters, notarized signatures. But each stamp, each signature, was like loading another round into a magazine. I was reclaiming legal control over every square inch of the roads, the stormwater easements, and the small green spaces the HOA proudly called common areas. I now owned the asphalt their residents drove on, the pipes that kept their basements from flooding, and the park where they held their annual bake sale. They were living in a house of cards, and I was about to pull out the table. Meanwhile, Marcia must have sensed a change. I'd gone quiet. I wasn't calling, I wasn't complaining. I had simply stopped responding. In her mind, that must have looked like surrender. And like any bully who thinks they've won, she got bolder. She decided to make an example out of someone else to reinforce her power. Her target was a guy named Chris Ortega, an electrician who lived 3 streets down. Chris had a treehouse in his backyard for his kids, one he'd built with his own 2 hands. It had been there for 5 years. Suddenly, Chris got a violation notice. The treehouse was an unapproved auxiliary structure. He was fined $500 and ordered to tear it down. The whole neighborhood knew it was a message. I took down the guy with the cabin. "You're next." The pressure was building. People were scared. Whispers started circulating. But I stayed quiet. I let Marcia think she was in complete control. I let her tighten the screws. The final piece of the trap was delivered by the mailman a week later. It was a thick envelope with the HOA's logo, sent by certified mail. Inside was a formal notice. A mandatory all-hands meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the community clubhouse. The agenda was simple and printed in an aggressive bold font. Discussion and vote on commencing legal action against Parcel 7B owner Thomas Rigsby for unresolved violations and recovery of fines. They were going to try and humiliate me in public. They were going to hold a show trial and vote to sue me into oblivion. I read the notice, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for. They were personally inviting their executioner to the gallows. I walked over to my computer, pulled up my email, and found the RSVP address listed at the bottom of the notice. I typed a short, simple reply. 5 words. Then I hit send. It read, "Thank you. I will attend." I arrived at the clubhouse 10 minutes early. It was one of those sterile, beige rooms with cheap folding chairs and fluorescent lights that hummed just loud enough to get on your nerves. I took a seat in the back row, a thick manila folder resting on my lap. The room filled up quickly. Most people looked either angry, scared, or just plain tired. They were tired of the fines, tired of the inspections, tired of living under Marcia's thumb. Chris Ortega caught my eye from across the room and gave me a grim, questioning look. I just gave a slow, deliberate nod. A signal, hold steady. At 7 o'clock sharp, Marcia and the 4 other board members took their seats at a long table at the front. Marcia banged a small gavel, the sound ridiculously self-important in the quiet room. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces until they landed on me. A flicker of surprise, then a smug smile. She clearly thought I was there to beg. "The meeting of the Lakewood Bluffs Homeowners Association will now come to order," she announced, her voice dripping with mock solemnity. She went through the roll call like a drill sergeant, each board member chirping present. Then she launched into her speech. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive nonsense, all about protecting our shared investment and maintaining community standards. Finally, she got to the main event. "As you all know," she began, turning to look directly at me, "we have an ongoing issue with a non-compliant structure built on Parcel 7B. She proceeded to list every supposed violation, every fine, every warning letter, her voice getting louder and more theatrical with each sentence. "This builder," she spat the word, "has refused to comply. He has refused our generous offers to resolve this matter amicably. Therefore, the board has been left with no choice." She paused for dramatic effect. "Tonight, we are here to vote on authorizing our legal counsel to pursue all available remedies, including the foreclosure and seizure of this illegal structure." A low murmur went through the crowd. This was it. The public hanging. She was trying to turn me into a cautionary tale. She was going to make an example of me to keep everyone else in line. She let the tension hang in the air for a full minute, just basking in it. Then she looked at me with that condescending smile and asked, "Mr. Rigsby, do you have anything to say for yourself before the board casts its vote?" I took a slow breath. This was the moment. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping softly on the linoleum floor. The folder felt heavy in my hand. "As a matter of fact, I do," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the quiet room. I walked to the front of the room, my footsteps echoing. I didn't approach her table. I stood to the side, facing the residents. I opened my folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "I've made some copies for everyone," I said, handing a stack to Chris, who immediately started passing them down the rows. I gave another stack to a woman in the front row. The board members looked at each other, confused. Marcia's smile faltered. "What is this?" she demanded. "This is an unauthorized disruption." I ignored her and turned my attention back to the residents, who were now looking at the documents in their hands. "What you're holding," I said, my voice rising just enough to command the room, "is a copy of the original land grant and private easement agreement for this entire development. It might be a little boring, but I encourage you to look at page 3, section 2. A rustling of paper filled the room. That section clarifies something very important. The company that built your houses never actually owned the roads you drive on, the sidewalks your kids ride their bikes on, or the common areas this clubhouse is built on." I let that sink in. I looked at the board table. Their faces were a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Marcia's was turning a blotchy red. "Those assets," I continued, "were retained by the original landowner, a holding company called Rigsby & Sons, LLC. I paused, letting my name hang in the air. An LLC that I own. And I have to say, I was very surprised when I found out that for the last 2 years, the Lakewood Bluffs HOA has been illegally claiming jurisdiction over land it has no legal right to." The gasps were audible. A woman in the third row whispered, "Oh my God!" Marcia shot to her feet. "This is absurd. Lies. Our attorneys have verified all of our boundaries." "You are out of order!" I held up my hand, not looking at her. I also included a certified report from Alvin Shrub, the former senior county surveyor. It confirms that your HOA illegally and unilaterally expanded its boundaries 2 years ago, absorbing 6 private properties, including mine, without the consent of a single homeowner. In the eyes of the law, that expansion never happened. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing at the board. Marcia banged her gavel over and over. Order! Order! I raised my voice over the chaos. Which means, as of this moment, every single one of you who is part of this association is technically trespassing on private property owned by my company. Absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Marcia stared at me, her mouth hanging open, all the smug superiority gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. Therefore, I said, delivering the final blow, I am informing the board and all its members that your access agreement to these roads and facilities is hereby terminated. You have 30 days to vacate or to contact my attorney, Beth Wainwright. Her card is stapled to the front of your packet to negotiate new access agreements on an individual, household-by-household basis. As for the HOA itself, since its authority is based on a fraudulent claim to land it doesn't control, well, it seems to me the Lakewood Bluffs HOA no longer exists in any meaningful legal form. Marcia finally found her voice. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. He's crazy. He can't do this. He forged these documents. But it was too late. The dam had broken. A man in the back of the room, someone I didn't even know, was on his phone. He suddenly shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. He's right. I just called my realtor. She looked it up on the county database. The main access roads, they're all registered to a Rigsby & Sons LLC. It's real. We're not in an HOA anymore. The room turned on Marcia. The fear was gone, replaced by years of pent-up anger. For a moment, I thought they were going to rush the table. The illusion of her power had been shattered, and all that was left was a frightened woman with a useless gavel. The aftermath of that meeting was like watching a dam burst in slow motion. The HOA didn't just crack, it disintegrated. By noon the next day, 2 of the board members had emailed their resignations. By evening, a third had quietly packed a moving truck and just disappeared. They knew they'd been riding Marcia's coattails, enjoying the little bit of power it gave them, but they weren't willing to go down with the ship. But Marcia wasn't the type to surrender. She was like a cornered animal, twice as vicious and 10 times as desperate. Her official power was gone, so she switched to guerrilla tactics. She started going door to door, a wild look in her eyes, peddling a new set of lies. She told people I was a corporate vulture, that my LLC was a front for a big developer. She whispered that I was going to bulldoze the little park by the entrance and put up high-density condos. She warned them I was going to install toll gates on the roads and charge them every time they left for groceries. It was pure, uncut fear-mongering. I expected this. A person like Marcia doesn't just admit defeat. Power is like a drug to them, and she was in the throes of a very ugly withdrawal. While she was spreading rumors, my son Jake was doing what he does best, digging. He has this quiet, methodical patience, a skill he picked up in the army. He knows his way around public records, laws, and freedom of information requests better than most lawyers. He told me, "Dad, her whole power play was built on paperwork. Let's see what their paperwork says about them." He filed a series of requests with the county for all official HOA correspondence, meeting minutes, and financial disclosures from the past 3 years. He was looking for the paper trail that led to that illegal land grab. I knew Marcia was desperate, but I never imagined she'd be this reckless. A week after the disastrous meeting, my attorney, Beth, got a call. It was from the county courthouse. Marcia Dorr had filed an emergency injunction against me and my LLC. The filing was a work of fiction. In it, she claimed my deeds were forgeries. She accused me of manufacturing a complex conspiracy to defraud the good people of Lakewood Bluffs. And to back it up, she had attached a signed affidavit, supposedly from a board meeting, granting her emergency powers to act on the HOA's behalf. She was doubling down, trying to use the court system to bog me down in a legal swamp. The injunction hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Marcia was buying herself time, hoping to scare me into backing down. But she made one critical mistake. She put her lies in writing and filed them with the court. She committed perjury. Jake got the notification about the injunction filing online at the same time Beth did. He read Marcia's affidavit, the one detailing this emergency meeting, and a slow grin spread across his face. He cross-referenced the date and time of her supposed meeting with the documents he'd just received from his public records request. "Dad, come look at this," he said, pointing to his computer screen. On one side was Marcia's sworn statement, claiming the full board met and voted to grant her these powers. On the other side were the official time-stamped emails from the county records. 2 of those board members had submitted their resignations a full day before this emergency meeting was supposed to have taken place. There was no quorum. The meeting could not have legally happened. And at the bottom of the affidavit, alongside her own signature, was another one. Louise Grant, the board secretary, the woman who idolized Marcia. "She didn't just lie, Dad," Jake said, his voice quiet. "She forged it." He immediately forwarded the evidence to Beth, who then forwarded it to the district attorney's office with a very pointed cover letter. Things moved fast after that. 2 days before our court hearing, 2 county sheriff's deputies and a detective in a cheap suit pulled up to Marcia's house. It wasn't a friendly visit. They had a warrant. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as officers carried out 2 laptops, a desktop computer, and 3 boxes of documents from her home office. The rumor mill, the one Marcia had so carefully cultivated, exploded. But this time, the story wasn't about me. It was about her. She was being investigated for fraud and forgery. I could have let the justice system do its work. I could have sat back and watched her self-destruct. But that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about the entire rotten structure she had built. The system that allowed a petty tyrant to terrorize a community needed to be torn out by the roots. I needed to send a message that this could never happen again. So, I made my next move. Using my authority as the owner of the infrastructure, I had Beth draft another set of documents. These weren't fines or warnings. They were formal eviction notices. We calculated a fair market rate for 20 years of unauthorized use of the private roads and common areas. A staggering sum. Then we sent a notice, via a very official-looking process server, to every single household that was still on the books as a member of the now-defunct HOA. The notice was simple. Pay the back rent for decades of trespassing in full within 30 days, or vacate the property. The news of the police raid was a spark. The eviction notices were a barrel of gasoline. Panic swept through the neighborhood. My phone started ringing off the hook, but I didn't answer. I let the pressure build. Then, the local news got wind of it. A reporter from the city paper called me, then called Marcia, then started talking to the panicked residents. The next morning, the story was on the front page of the local section. The headline was a thing of beauty, a perfect summary of the beautiful, chaotic mess I had created. Man who wasn't in the HOA now owns it, and is evicting the whole thing. The newspaper headline was a depth charge. The quiet fear that had been simmering in the neighborhood for years finally boiled over into outright panic. My tactic had worked perfectly. For years, these homeowners had allowed Marcia to operate because it was easier to stay quiet than to fight back. They paid her bogus fines and complied with her ridiculous rules because they were insulated, each dealing with her one-on-one. Now, the threat wasn't a $50 fine for having the wrong color mailbox. It was losing their homes. They were all in the same boat, and it was sinking fast. The reaction was immediate and fractured. Some residents, the ones who had been Marcia's staunchest supporters, turned on her with the ferocity of a betrayed cult. They picketed her house, demanding she fix this. Others, the majority who had just kept their heads down, began to panic in a different way. They started calling Beth's office, begging for amnesty, pleading that they were just victims of Marcia's scheme. My front gate, which had been quiet for weeks, suddenly had a parade of visitors. People left notes in my mailbox. Chris Ortega called and told me people were stopping him in the street, asking what they could do. I wasn't trying to throw dozens of families out on the street. I was trying to perform a surgical removal of a cancer. So I set my terms. It wasn't about money. It was about justice, and ensuring this kind of tyranny could never take root again. Beth sent out a formal letter on behalf of my LLC to every single household. The offer was simple. First, the eviction and the back rent would be forgiven completely. Second, I would grant them all new, permanent, and recorded deeded access licenses to the roads and common areas for a one-time administrative fee of $1. But there was a condition. The offer was only valid for residents who signed a legally binding petition. That petition had two purposes. First, to formally and irrevocably dissolve the Lakewood Bluffs Homeowners Association, and second, to bar Marcia Dorr from ever holding any position of community leadership, paid or volunteer, within the neighborhood for life. They had 1 week to sign. The community had to choose: save their homes by dismantling the weapon that had been used against them, or stick with the woman who had led them to the brink. It was a loyalty test, and the outcome was never really in doubt. Chris Ortega became the de facto organizer, a role he took to with quiet competence. He printed copies of the petition and set up a folding table in his driveway with a sign that just said, "The petition." People lined up down the street. It was a slow, steady stream of neighbors who had been divided by fear, now united in a common cause. My son Jake saw an opportunity for a final public reckoning. "Dad, we can't just let this fade away," he said. "People need to see it end." Publicly, he arranged for the final vote count and signing to take place, not in the tainted clubhouse, but on neutral ground, the big meeting room at the local fire station. And, because he's a man of his generation, he decided to live stream the whole thing. He wanted to make sure there was an undeniable public record of the HOA's death. The day of the meeting was bright and cold. The fire station meeting room was packed even tighter than the clubhouse had been. Jake had a camera set up on a tripod, and Chris had a laptop open. The live stream viewer count already climbing into the hundreds as people from around town tuned in to watch the drama unfold. One by one, Chris called the name of each household, and one by one, a resident would walk to the front, sign the petition, and drop their signed access agreement into a clear plastic box. The mood was somber but determined, like people signing a Declaration of Independence. Then, just as the last few people were signing, the doors to the room swung open. It was Marcia. She looked terrible. Her hair was a mess, her face was pale, and she had the frantic, hunted look of someone who knows the game is over but can't stop playing. She strode to the front of the room, ignoring the jeers and heckles from the crowd. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I built this community. I protected your investments. This man is a liar. He's trying to destroy us." A few of her old cronies, Louise Grant among them, stood up as if to support her, but they were drowned out by a wave of angry shouting. "Sit down, Marcia!" Someone yelled from the back. "You destroyed us!" Chris Ortega stepped up to the microphone. "Marcia, it's over!" He looked out at the crowd. "The final tally is in. Of the 87 households governed by the HOA, 87 have signed the petition. The vote to dissolve is unanimous." A wave of applause and cheers washed through the room. Marcia just stood there, stunned into silence, as her entire kingdom evaporated in a single moment. As the celebration continued, 2 sheriff's deputies, who had been standing quietly in the back, walked to the front of the room. One of them, a tall man with a calm, tired face, approached Marcia. She saw him coming and puffed out her chest, preparing for one last fight. "I'm going to sue every single one of you!" she shrieked. The deputy didn't even blink. He spoke in a low, even voice that somehow cut through all the noise. "Not from a holding cell, you won't," he said. "Marcia Dorr, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and misuse of public trust." He took her arm, and she didn't resist. All the fight seemed to drain out of her at once. As he led her out of the room, her final, desperate attempt to rally her followers had ended in handcuffs. The crowd parted to let them pass, watching in stunned, satisfied silence. Her reign was officially, and very publicly, over. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the live stream had ended, I drove back to my property. I walked up to the cabin for the first time in weeks, without that heavy sense of dread in my gut. I opened the door. The air inside was still and smelled of sawdust and new beginnings. I walked over to the big window overlooking the water. The sun was setting, painting the lake in strokes of orange and purple. Sarah would have loved this. The fight was over. There was peace. The fallout was swift and absolute. Facing a mountain of evidence and the testimony of her own former board members, Marcia Dorr didn't even bother with a trial. She took a plea deal. The local paper ran a small story on page 3, next to the classifieds. She pleaded guilty to felony fraud and misuse of public trust. She got 2 years probation, a hefty fine, and was legally barred from ever serving on any board or committee again, public or private. It was a quiet, pathetic end to her reign of noise and fury. Her guilty plea opened the floodgates. The state attorney general's office launched a full-scale investigation into the consulting firm that had helped Marcia and the board rewrite those maps, uncovering a pattern of predatory practices targeting smaller, non-HOA properties across the state. A class-action lawsuit followed, and over the next year, dozens of homeowners in our neighborhood began receiving refund checks in the mail, reimbursement for years of illegal fees, fines, and dues they'd been bullied into paying. The system that had allowed Marcia to thrive was being publicly dismantled, piece by painful piece. Even the county had to admit its mistake. They sent me a thick, apologetic letter from their legal department, acknowledging their oversight in approving the fraudulent plat map without proper due diligence. Tucked inside was a settlement offer, a check for $50,000 to compensate me for my legal fees and emotional distress. I looked at the check. It was more than the fine that started this whole nightmare. A year ago, that money would have been a lifeline. Now, it just felt hollow. This fight was never about money. It was about a promise I made to my wife. I sent the check back with a letter of my own. I told them I didn't want their money. Their cash couldn't give me back the months of peace I'd lost or erase the ugly red sign they had allowed to be stapled to my cabin door. But, I told them, there was one thing they could do. The little body of water the cabin sat on was officially known on the maps as Creek Reservoir 3. It was a dull, bureaucratic name for a beautiful place. In my letter, I formally requested that the county board vote to rename it. I asked them to call it Sarah's Lake. A few months passed. The leaves on the oaks began to turn from green to gold. One sunny Saturday, my son Jake stood on the new dock we'd just finished building. Next to him were 4 other veterans, all guys he knew from his unit or the local VA. They were all carrying scars, some you could see and some you couldn't. He had started a monthly fishing retreat, a quiet place for guys like him to come and just be still for a weekend. The sound of their quiet conversation and the occasional laugh drifted up to the cabin. I watched them from the deck, a mug of coffee, warm in my hands. The cabin had found its purpose. It wasn't just a memorial anymore. It was a living place, a place of healing. That's what Sarah would have wanted. The whole neighborhood felt different. The oppressive quiet, the feeling that everyone was being watched, was gone. Kids' bicycles, once confined to driveways, were now left on lawns without fear of a violation notice. The nasty, professionally printed signs at the neighborhood entrance, the ones that read, "Private HOA property, no trespassing," had been taken down. Chris Ortega and a few other neighbors had pulled them out of the ground the day after Marcia's arrest. For a while, the posts stood there, bare and splintered. Then one weekend, a new sign appeared. It was simple: hand-carved out of a single plank of cedar. The letters were a little uneven, clearly made by someone with more heart than skill, but the message was perfect. It just said, "Welcome. This is our lake." The name change had been approved unanimously by the county board. It was official. Every map, every GPS now pointed the way to Sarah's lake. I looked from the new sign at the end of the road, to the veterans fishing on the dock, to the warm light spilling from the windows of the finished cabin. I had started this project just to build a small wooden structure by the water. I just wanted to keep a promise. But in fighting for that small piece of ground, for that one small promise, something much bigger had been won back. I didn't just build a cabin. I reclaimed a community,